Hey guys, so there was a Reddit post called "How important is it to run a Fizz ranged?" This has been something that I've had an opinion on since week 2 when I genuinely was looking at clear groups that were not running a Fizz ranged whatsoever, and it actually ran perfectly fine. I do want to add a very clear disclaimer that I don't believe that this is going to be okay to run without a Fizz ranged when we're talking about Future's Rewritten Ultimate, which I always call the furry raid. I definitely believe that we will need a Fizz range there. However, for the incredible majority of players who realistically won't be tackling that content, I don't believe that you actually need a Fizz ranged in Savage at this point. I don't believe you need them in Extreme at this point whatsoever. As someone who has healed week 1 PF, I no longer care about that 1% buff to the group. We're not going to die from losing 1% max HP at this point. Even back then, it really wasn't that much of a concern. We should not be failing in Rage from the loss of the buff either. Physical ranged and Savage content at this point really isn't mandatory. And again, this is just one particular douchebag's opinion on the internet. Whether you agree with that or not, totally understand if you don't. But even in week 2, like I said, some of my PF groups were genuinely already cutting out Fizz ranged and replacing it with a caster for M4S clears. Now, if you want my preference in terms of which casters to take, it would definitely be Black Mage and Pictomancer. And yes, I did say Black Mage, the same one that has all the controversy around it. Black Mage is highly performant right now. It is absolutely beating out some of the melee DPS. I currently will have FF logs, some damage numbers posted here. You can see that Black Mage is the 4th highest damage output and clearly is doing more than fine. However, if you look at all of the Fizz range DPS, Bard, Dancer, and then Machinist, where Machinist quite frankly is performing abysmally, I genuinely do believe that Machinist deserves a buff at this point. I think that that's absolutely depressing to see. But yeah, basically Bard, Dancer, Machinist, they're performing so much lower on damage that if you look at something like a Pictomancer or Black Mage, that you will get a lot more mileage in general out of them. However, we do need to take into account, hey, that's a 1% buff for everyone's damage, health across the party. What does that really mean to you, Cole? My response to that would be, rather than a more pessimistic outlook, it would be a more optimistic outlook that many different team compositions are very viable in Savage, which I don't think is a bad thing. Because take the instance where you have someone who really is into caster. Hey, we already have a caster. You know what? I know that you really wanted to play Black Mage or Pictomancer, but we already got a Pictomancer. So you know what? You are unfortunately relegated to the role that, and I'll talk about this later in the video, but basically, physical ranged really seems to have gone the short end of the stick. I'll put it that way. And before people are down my throat saying, well, that's not true, it is actually the hardest role to fill in Party Finder aside from the healer role in my experiences, particularly physical range DPS. Melee, I've found melee very easy to fill. Caster, I've found very easy to fill. But specifically physical range DPS, that almost always is the one DPS slot that takes the longest to fill. Ergo, why I'm pretty convinced it's not that popular, on top of the more organic issues that physical ranged have that we'll talk about later. But to make sure that I put a bow on it, I don't think it's a bad thing that we are allowed to take double caster compositions into Savage. And by that, just to make sure that I am very clear, because I know someone in the comments will disagree, that means 2 tanks, 2 healers, 2 melee DPS, and 2 caster DPS, and 0 physical ranged. I don't think it's a bad thing that we have that as an option. And now here is where I'm going to start to be not toxic, because I don't think it's toxic to talk about these things candidly. I think way too many people get way too defensive. Like when I said that White Mage is inferior to Astrologian, and it is, and no, respectfully, Thin Air does not make up for it. Like, I literally went into over 2 hours explaining why. And I still had people argue with me. do not be so attached to your job's balance, because the reason why I did things like that 2-hour White Mage video was because I want to play White Mage. I'm a very, very selfish person, and whenever I bring up a balance thing, it's because I have an interest in it. So don't think that it's motivated just from the goodness of my heart. I want to play all the healers. We only have 4. Let me have my... But I digress. But when I'm bringing up these balance things with finished range, please don't feel personally attacked. That's clearly, I hope, clearly not my goal. I don't know how else to say it other than very directly like this. I'm going to start off by saying physical ranged does not feel great to play. And obviously, I just said that in Party Finder, it's the hardest role to fill. And like I have said many times on this channel, if there is an issue, you don't need a strike to bring it up to the surface. You don't need to throw some hissy fit or give it a fancy title. It will bubble up to the surface organically if there are issues. And lo and behold, physical range DPS is the one DPS role that is not filling super quick. Now I'll say it, and it is not meant as an insult. Physical ranged is I think, very easy to argue to be one of the easier roles in the game. I say this because of mobility. Obviously, this is on a case-by-case basis, because sometimes they need to handle mechanics that are definitely a little bit more spicy. I also say this as someone who has enjoyed very much playing Bard in the past, and I do acknowledge that with all of its host of procs and things that it needs to keep on top of, that it is definitely significantly more challenging to play. But in general, if you are aware of your rotation, if you are going in there on a physical range, realistically you are having probably one of the easier times in the group, respective to, say, like a barrier healer that needs to alternate and flex what they're doing on the fly. And I realize that this is going to make the comment section really spicy, but respectfully, I don't think that this is actually that controversial of something to say. Physical ranged, I definitely believe if someone just wanted to get a clear in a fight and learn as few things as possible and just tunnel visioned on, say, machinist or dancer, that would be the easiest role in the game. Which is so interesting, because even if it is your easiest, most clear-cut path to victory, even if you will have an easier time getting spots in a Party Finder group, we are still not seeing people go in on physical range DPS. And I'm not above saying it. If I did not truly enjoy healing and I just wanted to get the fights done with knowing as little about the fight as possible and tunnel visioning, I would go physical range DPS. And yet people are not drawn enough to the role in spite of that fact. And to me, that's very telling that we have a lot of issues here. And I'll start with the fact that they are realistically the lowest damage in the game. Bard, Dancer, Machinist, all of them are at the absolute lowest end. And then people, I know, will say in the comments, just because they don't fully acknowledge or realize or want to acknowledge what's going on here, when we are looking at the numbers of Bard and Dancer, these are our DPS numbers. These are taking into account the buffs that they're giving out the group. No, your Dancer is not suddenly going to be doing higher damage than the Pictomancer or Viper on this chart, even if they're partnered with the Pictomancer or the Viper. That highest dot that you see for Bard, that highest dot that you see for Dancer, is likely them parsing with a extremely high parsing Viper or Pictomancer, if probably both, if I'm honest. Even taking that all into account, they are still so far behind in terms of damage that it actually feels terrible. To that effect, we also need to ask about their utility. Red Mage and Summoner, they bring the single best utility in the game. And while I do know that lovely people say there are no body checks in bossing, say, I can tell you, as someone who has died to Sunrise Sabbath, as someone who, and maybe the footage will even be in this video, I literally got out a revive just in the nick of time, purely because I was on Astra and used Lightspeed. And yet people tell me, hey, Lightspeed on Astra's not as good of a prog tool as White Mage just in there. Brother in Christ, literally there's footage gonna be somewhere in this video showing just how tight that timing was. That person, the person that was revived, is actually a hero. That person was a hero because they immediately went to their spot. But I digress here. That revive is useful utility, even if you're in a reclear group, as shown in the footage. But Red Mage Summoner bring that. They're down here. So Bard, Dancer, and Machinist real utility is in the party mitigations. You could really argue, yes, Dancer brings some heal, Bard brings a heal amp, and Machinist, I do believe that Dismantle will be very useful in Ultimate. I'm the first person to say that mitigation will absolutely find mileage somewhere. But realistically, most people aren't going to go into an Ultimate, so that feels so contrived for me to say here in a general video where we're talking and currently have the Savage tier ongoing. None of these jobs are bringing utility that is going to make or break a damage or a heal check. Why I say that is because in Party Finder, I can't trust you to use these if I'm on Berry Healer. And that sounds so awful to say, but Party Finder is really the Wild West, and so even if you do bring those utilities like Dismantle, I can't trust that you're going to do it, and so it kind of is pointless. And so if someone propositioned to me, oh, we're not going to have a physical range, instead we're going to take a Pictomancer and Black Mage, why would I have an issue with it? I think that that's really a fair question. And even if we're talking about a lack of mitigation, the only caster that isn't bringing some kind of team-wide utility is literally Black Mage. And then you could also argue, but hey, isn't Adel being equivalent to like the Ranged DPS thing? And it's not equivalent. Ranged DPS is better. However, you absolutely do have Adel as Black Mage, but you aren't going to have the other utility like a Dismantle. So, but I digress even on that point. I'm getting way too deep in the weeds, but hopefully that makes my point clear. I'm not going to have an issue if we're running a re-clear for M4S as a double caster. Not today, not tomorrow. Didn't have an issue with it 2 weeks ago. Or, I mean on week 2.